The hall was big, bigger than any building humans had ever made. The ceiling was so high that clouds formed near the top of it, thin white wisps drifting slowly in the filtered alien air. The walls were carved from black stone pulled from the cores of dead planets, and the light inside came from burning gas trapped in long tubes of glass. It was the kind of place that was built to make you feel small. That was the point. The Valratha Grand Council Chamber had been designed 10,000 years ago for one reason: to remind every species in the galaxy that the Valratha were above them. The seats inside were made from the bones of kings from 40 different worlds. The floor was polished with the dust of moons they had shattered just to prove they could. Everything about this place was a message. Everything said, "We are old, we are powerful, and you are nothing." Today, that message was going out to the whole galaxy. The High Sovereign stood at the center of the chamber. He was tall, 3 times the height of a human, with 8 limbs and skin the color of dark ash. His eyes were yellow and wide, and they never blinked. Around his neck hung chains made from the identification tags of dead soldiers from every war the Valratha had ever won. There were a lot of chains. He raised 4 of his arms, and the chamber went quiet. Outside, across every ship in known space, across every colony, every station, every planet with a receiver, screens turned on. People stopped walking. Pilots sat up in their chairs. Even alien species who had nothing to do with the situation tuned in, because when the Valratha spoke to the whole galaxy at once, it meant something big was happening. The High Sovereign began to speak. His voice was deep and slow. Every word came out like a stone being dropped into still water. He spoke in the common tongue, the shared language all space-faring species had agreed to use, so there would be no confusion, no room for misunderstanding. He started with history. He talked about the Valratha Empire, 4,000 years old, never defeated, never stopped. He listed every species they had ever conquered. He said the names slowly, one by one, letting each one land. Some of those species no longer existed. He said that too. Then he talked about humanity. He said humans were a young species, barely 300 years in space. He said they were aggressive, loud, and completely without wisdom. He said they had been warned many times to stay inside their borders, to stop expanding, to show respect to those who had been in the stars long before them. He said humanity had ignored every warning. He said humans had looked the Valratha in the eye. He paused there. The silence stretched out across the galaxy. Then he read the decree of eradication. It was formal. Every word had been chosen carefully. It said that humanity had broken the peace, that they were a danger to galactic order, and that the Valratha Empire, in its duty to maintain that order, had decided to remove the human species from the stars. He did not say kill. He said remove, but everyone knew what he meant. At the end, someone off-screen lit a fire. Into that fire, they dropped a piece of cloth, the banner of the Human Defense Coalition, the blue and white flag that flew over every human colony. It burned quickly. The High Sovereign watched it burn, and then he looked back at the screen with his wide yellow eyes. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The broadcast cut out. For a moment, the whole galaxy was quiet. Deep underground, beneath what used to be called Sol, inside a room with no windows and walls made of layered steel and reinforced concrete, 31 people sat around a long black table and watched the screen go dark. No one moved. The air in the room was cold, the kind of cold that comes from machines running too hard for too long. The lights were bright and white, and they made everyone look a little pale. On the walls, screens showed maps, fleet positions, colony updates, population numbers. Red markers were already appearing, Valratha ships moving. Junho sat to the right of the head of the table. He was a careful man. He kept his notes organized and his voice level. He had worked in military strategy for 20 years, and in that time he had learned to stay calm in bad situations. But his hands were flat on the table right now and pressing down, because if he didn't press them down they might shake. He looked at the numbers on the screen. 40,000 warships, moving in formation. The largest military force ever assembled in recorded history, pointed directly at human space. He looked at the head of the table. Una was sitting there. She was not a big woman. She was average height, average build, with short black hair and a face that gave away almost nothing. She was wearing a dark coat with no medals on it, because she had never liked medals. She was 44 years old and she had been running the Human Defense Coalition for 6 of those years, and in that time she had never once raised her voice in a meeting. She was watching the dark screen. Her fingers were laced together in front of her. Her back was straight. Her face was still. The silence in the room stretched out. Junho leaned slightly toward her. He spoke quietly, like a man who wasn't sure he should be speaking at all. "Commander," he said, "they've mobilized 40,000 warships. Our current projections say we have maybe." Una raised one hand, just slightly, just enough. He stopped. She kept looking at the screen for another moment. Then she closed her eyes. Then she opened them. "Good," she said. It was barely loud enough to hear. She said it like someone who had just been told that a long-delayed train was finally arriving. Not afraid, not surprised, quiet, like something had been confirmed. The room stared at her. She unclenched her hands, pressed both palms flat on the table and stood up. She smoothed the front of her coat. She looked around the room once, not to reassure anyone, just to see who was there. "Get Dohan out of his lab," she said. "Tell him he has a blank check. Everything he asked for he gets it. No more waiting." She picked up the small data pad from the table in front of her. "Wake up T-Sung. Tell him the war he's been waiting for is here." She walked toward the door. "And tell Rena to start moving her people." She paused at the door with her back still to the room. "We have work to do," she said. Then she walked out. Behind her no one spoke for a long moment. Then slowly the room began to move, people standing, screens changing, voices starting low and then rising. Somewhere down the hall a door slammed open. Somewhere else, an alarm that had never been activated in 6 years finally turned on. The war had been announced, and the woman who had been waiting for it had already started planning the end of it. The lab smelled like burned metal and old coffee. It always smelled like that. Dohan had been working in this underground facility for 11 years, and in 11 years he had never once opened a window because there were no windows. He had never taken a proper vacation. He had eaten most of his meals at his desk. He had slept on a narrow cot in the corner of his office more times than he could count, and he had done all of this without complaint because the work was interesting. The work was, in his own words, the most important work any human being had ever done. Most people who heard that assumed he was exaggerating. He was not. When the door to his lab opened and a young officer stepped in holding a data pad with the authorization codes on it, Dohan was standing at a long white table covered in diagrams. He was a thin man with tired eyes and ink on 3 of his fingers. He looked up. He looked at the authorization codes. He looked at the officer's face. Then he sat down on the floor. Not because he fainted, he just needed a moment. The officer stood there, unsure what to do. "Sir," the officer said. "Give me a second," Dohan said from the floor. He sat there for about 30 seconds. Then he stood back up, took the data pad, and signed his name at the bottom with the ink-stained hand. "Right," he said, and his voice was very calm, the way a man sounds when he has been waiting for something for so long that when it finally arrives he doesn't know what to feel. "Right, okay, wake everyone up. I want all senior engineers in Bay 7 in 20 minutes. He was already walking to the door. "And someone bring me coffee, real coffee, not the powder." Bay 7 was at the bottom of the facility, 5 floors underground. It was the size of a small town. When Dohan walked in and the lights came on, not the regular lights but the full lights, the ones that required special authorization, The engineers who had followed him stopped walking. The bay was full. Row after row of weapon systems, all covered in gray protective sheeting. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Long metal shapes, curved shapes, spherical shapes. Some were small enough to hold in both hands. Some were the size of buildings. Everything was organized, numbered, and labeled in small black text that was too small to read from the door. One of the engineers, a woman named Hyemi, who had been working on kinetic systems for 8 years, walked slowly to the nearest covered object and pulled back a corner of the sheeting. She looked at what was under it. She put the sheeting back carefully. Then she turned around and looked at Dohun. "How long?" she asked. 11 years, he said. She nodded slowly. "Does the commander know all of this is down here?" "She built it," Dohun said. "She just needed them to declare war first before she could use it." Yuna had started planning Project Last Word 15 years ago, not as a hope, not as a maybe, as a certainty. She had studied the Velratha the way you study a storm that is still far away but definitely coming. She had read everything, their history, their tactics, their psychology, the way their leaders thought, the way their military moved, the things they valued and the things they feared. She had built models and run simulations and asked hard questions that no one else wanted to ask yet, like, what happens if they decide to stop warning us and start shooting? Everyone else had said that wouldn't happen. Diplomacy was still possible. There was still time. Yuna had smiled politely and started building anyway. She had done it quietly. Budgets hidden inside other budgets. Engineers hired for projects that officially didn't exist. Factories in 3 separate star systems running night and day, making things that were not put into any public record. She had moved slowly and carefully because she knew that if the Velratha found out what she was building before she was ready, everything would fall apart. She had called it Project Last Word because she intended it to be exactly that. The last word in any conversation the Velratha tried to start. Now the conversation had started. T-Sung was in a gym when they found him. He was doing pull-ups. He was 51 years old and he could do 40 of them without stopping, which was something he was quietly proud of. He had served in the Human Defense Fleet for 28 years. He had been in 6 border conflicts and 2 full engagements with Velratha scouting forces. He had a long scar down his left forearm from a piece of shrapnel he had kept as a reminder, and he had short gray hair that he kept neat out of habit, not vanity. When the message came through, he dropped from the bar, dried his hands on a towel and read it once. Then he read it again. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just nodded once, like a man who had been told the weather was finally changing. "Get my command crew together," he told his aide, "and get me a ship assignment, something fast." Rena was already moving before anyone called her. She had been watching the broadcast from a small room in a station near the outer edge of human space, and when the High Sovereign finished reading the decree of eradication, she had turned off the screen, stood up, and started packing. She didn't need orders. She knew what came next, because she and Yuna had written it together 3 years ago, sitting in this same small room with a pot of cold tea between them. She had people in Velratha space, 23 of them placed across 11 different locations. Some had been there for 5 years. Some had been there for 8. They had built lives there, fake names, fake histories, real friendships. They had learned the language perfectly. They had gotten jobs in places that mattered, fuel depots, communication relays, supply stations. They had been waiting. Rena sent a single coded message, 2 words. It had been agreed on years ago. It meant begin. Back in the war room, Junho was going through numbers, fleet positions, supply chains, estimated Velratha travel times. He was building a timeline on the screen in front of him, trying to figure out exactly how much time they had before the first contact. He found Yuna standing at the far end of the room, looking at a large map of human space. She had a cup of coffee in one hand and she was very still. "The Velratha think we're panicking right now," Junho said, coming to stand beside her. Their intelligence reports probably show civilian broadcasts full of fear. Their models are probably predicting that we send a desperate counteroffer within the next 72 hours. Yuna looked at the map. Let them think that, she said. Their advance fleet is moving faster than we expected, he continued. 12,000 ships. They'll enter our outer territory in 9 days. I know. Junho was quiet for a moment. The other alien species watching all of this, the ones the Velratha have been keeping under their thumb, they think this is over for us. Most of the signals we're picking up from neutral space are, he searched for the right word, sad. They feel sorry for us. Yuna said nothing. Junho looked at her. Aren't you going to say anything? She took a sip of coffee. She looked at the map for a moment longer. Then she looked at him. In 9 days, she said quietly, the galaxy is going to learn something new about us. She handed him a file. It was thick. He opened it and started reading, and as he read, the color left his face slowly, the way the sun goes down gradually and then all at once. When he looked up, she was already walking away. He looked back down at the file. He understood now why she had said *good. The Velratha High Admiral's name was Verk, and he had never lost a battle. He had commanded fleets for 30 years. He had crushed rebellions on 9 planets. He had broken 3 separate coalitions of smaller species who had foolishly decided to stand together against the Empire. Every campaign he had ever run had ended the same way, with him standing on the bridge of his flagship, looking at the wreckage of whatever had tried to stop him, calm and satisfied in the way that only complete victory can make you feel. He was not worried about humans. He stood at the front of his bridge and watched the 12,000 ships of the advance fleet move through space in clean, perfect formation. His flagship alone was 6 kilometers long. Around it, destroyers and carriers moved in organized rows, and behind those came the supply ships and troop transports. It was, by any measurement, an overwhelming force. The humans had nothing like this. Their ships were smaller. Their fleet was scattered across a wide area of space, guarding colonies and stations in every direction. When Verk's intelligence team had mapped the human defensive positions, they had laughed. There was no wall, no concentrated line, just scattered ships spread too thin, trying to cover too much space. It would be easy, it would be fast. A junior officer came to stand beside him. Admiral, scanners are picking up human vessels at the edge of the Daran system. They appear to be retreating. Verk looked at the screen. Several small clusters of human ships were moving away from the advance fleet's path, not fighting, not holding position, running. He made a sound that was close to a laugh. Follow them, he said. Don't let them get away. I want this done quickly. On the bridge of the steady hand asterisk, Commander Tsung sat in his chair and watched the Velratha fleet follow his decoy squadrons. He was quiet. His crew was quiet. Everyone on the bridge knew what was happening, what they were doing, what it required, what came next. They had trained for this exact scenario 14 times over the past 2 years. Tsung had personally designed the drill. He had made them run it until it was automatic, until every person on every ship involved could do their job in their sleep. They're following, his navigation officer said. Of course they are, Tsung said. He watched the screen. The Velratha fleet was large and it was fast and it was very confident. That confidence was the thing Yuna had counted on. Arrogant forces move without checking corners. They follow what's in front of them. They assume that anything running away from them is running because it's afraid, not because it's leading them somewhere. The decoy squadrons were leading them into a region of space between 2 dead star systems, twin stars that had burned out long ago, leaving behind 2 massive gravitational bodies and a corridor of space between them. The corridor had no colonies, no stations, no traffic. It had been empty for years. It had been empty because Yuna had quietly made sure no one used it. Inside, hundreds of asteroids drifting through that corridor, rocks that had floated there for millions of years, looking completely natural, were machines. Dohun's machines. Stored carefully, kept cold, kept still, kept silent. Waiting. "How far are we from the entry point?" Tisung asked. 4 minutes, his officer said. Tisung leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Tell the decoy squadrons to slow down just a little," he said. "Give the Valratha time to get deep inside before we close the door." High Admiral Verk noticed the human ship slowing and smiled. "They're losing their nerve," he said. "They don't know which way to run." He turned to his weapons officer. "Begin targeting the lead clusters. Let's finish." The message came from 6 jumps behind them. It was not a voice transmission. It was just a signal, a location ping from one of their resupply stations, followed immediately by nothing. The station had gone offline. Then the next one. Then the next. Verk turned slowly. "What just happened to our supply lines?" he said. No one answered because no one knew yet. The answer was that Rena's people, 23 men and women who had spent years living inside Valratha space, working inside those stations, learning every access code and bypass, had done their job in the space of 4 minutes. Every fuel relay station between the advance fleet and Valratha home space was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The door behind them had just closed. Then the asteroids opened. The drones came out in silence. There were so many of them that on the Valratha sensors they appeared first as a strange blurring of the screen, a kind of visual noise. Then the operators realized what they were looking at. Billions of small machines, each no bigger than a ground vehicle, moving in perfect coordinated formations that shifted and changed like schools of fish. Each drone was simple on its own. Together, they were a single weapon of extraordinary complexity. Dohun had spent 9 years designing the coordination network. The Valratha ships began to fire at them. Their weapons were powerful and accurate. They destroyed thousands of drones per second. There were too many drones. While the advance fleet was dealing with the swarm, Tisung's first fleet dropped out of stealth. They had been hiding behind the gravitational shadow of one of the dead stars, sitting completely still, engines off, heat signatures suppressed, invisible. Now they came forward fast and hard, and every ship was already firing before the Valratha had time to fully register that they were there. Tisung watched his screen. He did not smile. He did not say anything dramatic. He just watched and gave orders when orders were needed, in the steady, quiet voice of a man who had seen battle enough times to know that the only thing that mattered right now was doing the work. "Target their command ships first," he said. "Take the head off." Then the cascade bombs went off at the corridor entrance. The explosion did not look like a normal explosion. There was no fire in space, no orange and red bloom spreading outward. Instead, there was a deep shuddering in the fabric of space itself, a visible distortion like glass bending without breaking that moved outward in a slow ring and then contracted inward. Every Valratha ship inside that ring lost all power simultaneously, just stopped, dead in space. 4 hours and 17 minutes later, the battle was over. 12,000 ships gone. Tisung sent a one-line report back to the war room. "Advance fleet neutralized. Minimal losses on our side. They never had a chance." He looked at the screen for a long moment after sending it. Debris was drifting through the corridor now, slow and quiet. The drones had gone back into standby. The first fleet was moving in formation, doing damage checks. He thought about the Valratha High Admiral. He didn't know if the man was dead or floating in an escape pod somewhere. He didn't think it mattered much either way. What mattered was the message that the wreckage would send. The galaxy saw it. Every species with a telescope powerful enough, every monitoring station, every intelligence service that had been watching human space since the declaration of war, they all saw the same thing. 12,000 ships went in. Nothing came out. The silence that followed was different from the silence after the Velratha's declaration. That silence had been shock and sadness and resignation. This silence was something else. This silence was awe. In the Velratha home system, in the Grand Council chamber where the High Sovereign had stood just days ago reading his decree with complete confidence, the War Council received the battle report. They read it 3 times. They ran confirmation checks because they could not believe what the numbers said. Then they sat in silence for a very long time. One of the council members said, very quietly, what everyone was thinking. How did they do this? They should not have been able to do this. No one answered. In the underground war room beneath Seoul, Junho read the same report and then sat very still for a moment. Then he walked to where Yuna was standing at her map table and put the report down in front of her. She read it without expression. They'll send everything now, he said. All 40,000, the full fleet, the High Sovereign himself. Yuna looked at the map. The dead corridor between the 2 burned-out stars was marked on it, tiny, a small detail. I know, she said. She moved her finger to a different part of the map. That was the point. The Velratha had not moved like this in 400 years. When the full armada assembled, it took 3 days just to get everything into formation. 40,000 warships, ancient dreadnoughts that had been in service for 2 centuries, so large that smaller ships flew inside their docking bays the way birds fly into barns. Carrier vessels that could deploy 10,000 fighters each. Troop transports carrying ground forces for the occupation that the High Sovereign had already written orders for, because he was certain there would be human planets left to occupy when the shooting stopped. At the center of the formation was the High Sovereign's flagship, the Asterisk Eternal Throne. It was 11 kilometers long and had never been brought into battle before. It was not meant for battle. It was meant for presence. It was meant to be seen and to say, without words, this is what you chose when you refused to kneel. The High Sovereign stood on the bridge of the Asterisk Eternal Throne and felt something he did not fully recognize at first. It took him a moment to identify it, because he had not felt it in a long time. It was pressure. Not fear. He told himself it was not fear. It was simply the weight of what needed to be done. 12,000 ships had been destroyed. 12,000. That had never happened before. There would be consequences for that, political consequences, historical consequences. The Empire's reputation had taken a wound. This armada was the answer to that wound. This armada would cauterize it. He gave the order to move. The 3-system battle began at dawn, if dawn meant anything in space, and to the humans fighting it, it didn't, but T-Sung liked to think of it that way anyway. He had grown up on a planet. He still thought in planet terms. He was on the bridge of his new flagship, the Asterisk Iron Ground Asterisk, when the long-range sensors picked up the full armada dropping out of jump space. The number that appeared on the screen made his navigation officer go very still. 40,216 vessels, the officer said. T-Sung looked at the number. He had known it was coming. He had been told it was coming. Knowing a thing and seeing the number on a screen were different things, and for exactly 3 seconds he let himself feel the weight of it. Then he picked up his command headset and said, "All ships, this is Commander T-Sung. They are here. You have trained for this. You know what to do. Let's get to work." The human fleet was smaller, much smaller, but it was fast and it was spread across 3 star systems in a pattern that looked, to the Velratha, like scattered desperation, and which was, in reality, a web. The first engagements were brutal and close. Velratha dreadnoughts came in with overwhelming firepower, and the human ships did not try to fight them head-to-head. They moved fast, hit from angles, broke formation, and reformed somewhere else. They fought like water, always moving, always finding the lowest point, never staying where the enemy expected them to be. T-Sung personally commanded the central group, and in the 3rd hour of battle, When a Velratha dreadnought twice the size of the asterisk iron ground asterisk locked weapons on him, he did not retreat. He pushed forward. He pushed his ship directly toward the dreadnought, closing distance so fast that the bigger ship's weapons couldn't track him properly, and he fired every forward cannon at point-blank range into the dreadnought's underside where the armor was thin. The impact threw everyone on his bridge sideways. His left arm hit the edge of his console hard enough to fracture something. He could feel it, but he did not stop giving orders. The dreadnought broke in half. "Hit confirmed," his weapons officer said, voice tight. "Find the next one," Tsung said. 3 systems away, Dohun was not in a lab. He was in a deep bunker on a small moon, sitting in a chair in front of the most complicated control panel he had ever designed, which was saying something because he had designed a lot of complicated control panels. Around him sat 12 other engineers, all watching their own screens, all quiet, all focused. The control panel was connected to something that the Velratha did not know existed. 200 mass driver cannons, buried inside the moons and dead planets of Velratha territory itself. Rena's operatives had installed them over a period of 6 years, small teams, moving at night, working in the deep rock of places nobody ever went. The cannons were not the biggest weapons ever made, but 200 of them, firing at the same moment at carefully selected targets, power stations, military shipyards, jump gate relay points, would do something much more significant than physical destruction. It would tell the Velratha that their home was not safe. That was the thing Yuna had understood about the Velratha psychology from her years of study. They were not afraid of dying in battle, but they had never, not in 4,000 years, had to worry about their home ground. Their empire was the foundation they stood on. Take the feeling of safety from that foundation, and something broke inside them that weapons couldn't fix. Dohun watched the battle feeds. He was waiting for Yuna's signal. The High Sovereign opened a direct channel to the human fleet at the 6-hour mark of the battle. It was not common for a head of state to do this, to speak during an active engagement, but he wanted to speak to whoever was in charge. He wanted to look them in the eye. The face that appeared on his screen was a woman's face, calm, still. She looked like she was doing paperwork. He felt the pressure again, stronger this time. "I know who you are," he said. "You built all of this, you prepared all of this." Yuna said nothing. "You understand that this changes nothing," he said. "We have 40,000 ships. You cannot win by cleverness alone. Numbers are real, mass is real." "Yes," Yuna said. He waited for her to say more. She didn't. "You are an intelligent species," he said, and he chose the word species carefully to remind her that she was one small part of something he was about to end. Intelligent enough to understand when something is over. Yuna looked at him. Her face did not change. "You've been in this galaxy for 4,000 years, she said. Her voice was even, like she was explaining something to a student. "In those 4,000 years, you have conquered 81 species. You have ended 11 of them completely. You have never lost a war." He said nothing. "We," she continued, "almost wiped ourselves out twice before we left our own planet. We have survived ice ages and plagues and things we did to ourselves that were worse than anything an enemy ever did to us. We have been at the edge of extinction and we clawed our way back. Not because we were the strongest, because we do not stop." She looked at him for a moment. "You declared war on the only species in this galaxy that treats near extinction as practice." The High Sovereign stared at her. She reached forward and cut the channel. She looked to her left. Junho was standing there. She held out one hand. He put a small transmitter in it. She pressed the single button on it. 200 mass driver cannons fired at exactly the same moment. The concept of the sound reached the Velratha High Council before the reports did. The first sign was the communication feeds going strange, relay points flickering and dying. Then the reports started coming in, one after another, each one worse than the last. Their largest military shipyard gone. Their primary power station for the home system offline. 3 jump gates destroyed. Their home was being hit. Their asterisk home. The effect on the frontline fleet was immediate and visible. Ships lost coordination. Captains started sending frantic messages back to command. Some vessels began to pull back, not because they had orders to, but because something basic and instinctive said home is burning, go home. T-Sung felt the change in the battle the moment it happened. He had been told to watch for it. He recognized it. All fleets push forward, he said. Now don't let them regroup. The human ship surged. The web that had seemed like scattered desperation revealed itself, every group in every system moving at once, hitting from every direction, cutting off retreat lines, breaking formation after formation. The Velratha were still vast. They were still powerful. But a force that believes it is winning fights differently from a force that suddenly isn't sure. Doubt had gotten inside the armada like water getting into a crack, and now the crack was spreading. 6 hours later, the asterisk eternal throne was still intact but alone. The ships around it had been destroyed or scattered. The High Sovereign stood on his bridge and looked at his screens and saw, for the first time in his long life, what defeat looked like from the inside. He had no words for it. It felt like the floor had disappeared. The Eternal Throne went silent 3 days after the last major engagement. Not destroyed, just silent. No signals going out, no channels opening, no transmissions of any kind. The great 11-kilometer flagship sat motionless in space like a building with all its lights turned off. The human ships that found it reported that it was intact, no structural damage, no fires, no signs of internal fighting. It had simply stopped. They never found out exactly what happened on the bridge that day. Whatever the High Sovereign said or did in those final hours aboard his flagship, he kept to himself. What was known was that a single escape pod launched from the Eternal Throne 2 days later and drifted into neutral space, where it was retrieved by a third-party vessel belonging to a small alien species called the Murren, who had no interest in the war, and simply picked up the pod because picking up pods was what decent people did. The pod contained 1 passenger. The High Sovereign was alive. He was sitting in the pod's only seat, upright, hands in his lap, staring straight ahead. The Murren crew reported that he did not speak for 11 hours after they brought him aboard. When he finally did speak, he said only 4 words in the common tongue. It is all over. The Velratha Empire did not end with a surrender ceremony. There was no moment where someone in a formal uniform walked into a formal room and signed a formal document. The empire ended the way old things end, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece falling quietly while the next was still standing. It happened over months. The species that the Velratha had been taxing and threatening and controlling for centuries watched what had happened to the advance fleet and the armada, and they started making decisions. Some of them were small species, only a few planets, not much military strength, but they had been waiting a very long time, and now they did not wait anymore. They stopped paying the Empire's taxes. They stopped letting Velratha ships use their ports. They closed their borders. One by one, the outer edges of the Empire stopped being the Empire. The Velratha did not have the strength left to stop them. The myth was broken. 4,000 years of never losing had been the real foundation of their power, not the ships, not the weapons, but the asterisk belief that they could not be stopped. Humanity had not just beaten them in battle. Humanity had taken that belief apart in front of the entire galaxy, and without it, the Empire had nothing to hold its pieces together. It folded in on itself like a building with no frame. T-Sung spent 12 days in a medical bay. His arm had 2 fractures and some ligament damage that the doctors told him cheerfully would heal completely with rest and the regenerative wraps they had put on it. He spent those 12 days playing card games with whoever came to visit, which turned out to be a lot of people. His crew came in shifts. Junior officers came just to say they had been there. Some people he didn't even recognize brought him food from the commissary. He was not very good at resting, but he was very good at card games, and he won enough times to keep himself satisfied. On the 9th day, a message came through from Una. It was short, as all her messages were. It said, "Good work, take the full leave, you've earned it." He read it twice. He thought about sending a reply. Then he decided the best reply was to win the card game he was currently in the middle of, which he did. Dohan was already designing something new. Nobody had officially asked him to. There was no new threat on the horizon. No intelligence report suggesting another species was about to declare war on humanity. He was designing it because the work was interesting, and because he had spent 11 years building for a specific purpose, and now that purpose was done, he needed his hands to be doing something. The thing he was designing was large and complicated, and probably not necessary for at least 50 years. He was very happy. Hayami came into his lab one morning, actually morning this time, because he had started keeping slightly more normal hours, and found him humming while drawing diagrams on a long piece of paper. "You know the war is over," she said. "Yes," he said without looking up. "So what is that?" "Insurance," he said. She looked at the diagram for a moment. "That is not insurance," she said. "That is something else entirely." "Yes," he agreed pleasantly. She left him to it. Rena came back. She appeared one morning in the war room. No announcement, no entry log, simply there, sitting at a side table with a cup of tea, reading through reports. Junho, who had been working at his desk for 6 hours, looked up and saw her and did not ask how she had gotten in, because the answer would probably involve things he didn't need to know. "All 23 of your people?" he asked. "All 23 made it out," she said, without looking up from her report. He breathed out slowly. "Good." She turned a page. 3 of them are having a hard time adjusting. Years undercover takes something out of a person. I've arranged support. "And you?" he asked. She looked up at him then. She had a face that was very hard to read, which was probably a professional requirement. She considered his question for a moment. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm always fine." He wasn't entirely sure he believed her, but he nodded and went back to his work. The messages from other species started arriving in the 4th week. Some were cautious, some were formal, some were long and full of diplomatic language that said a great deal without saying very much. But the meaning underneath all of them was the same. "We watched what you did. We would like to talk." 43 civilizations in the first month. Then more. Species that had been under the Valratha's control for generations. Species that had stayed carefully neutral and now felt that neutrality was no longer enough. Small and medium-sized civilizations that had been watching the galaxy from a safe distance and now wanted to be part of something. They all wanted to sign something with humanity. Alliance agreements, mutual defense treaties, trade arrangements. Some of them just wanted a conversation, a contact, a presence on the human communication network. They wanted to be connected to whatever this was. Junho managed most of the incoming requests because Una delegated things like that to him. He read through them all, categorized them, flagged the important ones. One evening he brought a summary to her. She was standing at the large viewport on the upper level of the facility, one of the few places in the underground building that had a viewport, looking up through layers of transparent material at the darkening sky above Seoul. The city was lit up below, and the stars were beginning to come out above, and she was looking at both. He told her the numbers, 43 and growing. He told her about some of the more interesting requests, a small species called the Toval who had been occupied by the Valratha for 60 years, and were now free and wanted help rebuilding their defenses. An ancient neutral civilization called the Ashen who had not allied with anyone in 2,000 years and had now sent a message expressing, in careful old-fashioned language, that they wished to get to know humanity better. Some of the alien networks are still calling you a monster, he added. They're saying no species should be this prepared, this cold. Yuna said nothing for a moment. And the 43. They're saying they've never been so glad that someone was this prepared. He paused. And they're a little afraid of us. Good, she said. Fear is honest. It means they're paying attention. She looked at the stars. Start with the Toval, she said. They've been waiting the longest. And send something personal to the Ashen, not a form letter, something real. 2,000 years of neutrality is a hard thing to step back from. That deserves respect. Junho made a note. Anything else? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said, that's enough for tonight. He left her there at the viewport. The last scene of this story is a small one. 3 weeks later, a new junior analyst came to work in the war room. His name was Sihun, and he was 22 years old, and he had grown up watching the border tensions with the Valratha on the news the way people watch storms forming over water, with worry, but also with the belief that it would probably miss him. When the war came, he had been in officer training. He had watched all of it from a screen in a barracks room, surrounded by 40 other young officers who had done the same. Now he was here, and the war was over, and it still felt strange. The way things feel when something enormous has ended and ordinary life has to start again in the space it left behind. He was carrying a document, the official end-of-conflict report requiring the commander's signature. He found her at her desk working. He stood at the edge of her doorway and knocked twice. She looked up. Sir, he said, then corrected himself. Commander, I have the final report for your signature. She held out her hand. He brought it over. She read the top page, picked up her pen, and signed at the bottom. He took the document back, but he didn't move to leave. She looked at him. He was quiet for a second. Then, because he had been wanting to ask it since the day he arrived, and because some moments feel like they have a short window before they close. Commander, he said, when they made the announcement, the declaration of war, were you scared? She looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that takes in a person properly, not just their face but something behind it, the question behind the question, the thing underneath the words. She took the signed document from his hands. She squared it on her desk. Then very quietly, No, she said, I was ready. She handed the document back and looked down at her work. He walked out. The lights in the war room hummed the way they always did, constant and low and steady, like breathing. Maps still covered the walls. Screens still showed fleet positions and colony updates. The work continued, the way work always continues, because in the aftermath of one thing there is always the beginning of the next. But somewhere in the tone of the room, in the way the people inside it moved and spoke and sat at their desks, something was different from before. Something had settled. The weight that had been there for 15 years, the quiet, patient, held breath weight of waiting for it to come, was gone. It had come, they had been ready, that was enough. Outside, above the underground facility, above the city and its lights, the stars came out as they always did, indifferent and ancient and endlessly far away. They looked a little different now. Not smaller, just less frightening. Humanity had a way of doing that to things.